Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Good. And once again, Chris, we'll be talking about the Federal Reserve and what's happening and what we can anticipate, because more and more people are joining us in these concerns, and even people from Wall Street, I think, are frightened by this, and they don't approach it the same way we do, but I think they know it's coming, but they're still in the market because they can't miss it out. And it is astounding how high the market has gone, and nobody knows how much higher it will go because it doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's not unusual that markets work this way, especially at the end of a boom period. And that's what we're in. And it's probably the biggest boom in stocks that we have seen probably in the history of the world, because we've never seen interest rates down near zero, and some countries have them below zero. And some people believe ours will go below zero, which I believe if the system holds together, that's what we'll be doing, just passing out the money. And as Bernanke says, if the banks aren't going to respond and spend that money wisely and create jobs and prosperity for everybody and pass the money around, we're going to have to use the helicopters to pass the money out to the people. And of course, that is a possibility, because it would be throwing in the towel, and they're almost at that point of throwing in the towel when you see that they have to come to the rescue here just a couple of months ago, because interest rates, overnight rates shot up, over 10%. So they've come to the rescue, and now they're pumping $100 billion a month into the economy. The balance sheet is growing once again, even though they tried to tinker around and lower it, and that was an impossibility, which many people predicted. So they're between a rock and a hard place, and the only thing they have left is helicopter money. Just print more and more money, because they will not, try to restore order, because it's too painful. The withdrawal symptoms are so horrendous. It's just not going to happen. But people want the money, they want the spending, the special interests want it. It would be unpatriotic. It would be against our empire, and yet what we're doing is we'll do all those things they have concern about. So the treatment is temporary, just printing more money and running up more debt, but it does create a huge bubble. And size of the bubble, I would say, is going to be the biggest ever. We had a NASDAQ bubble collapse in 2000, and that was, a bit painful for a lot of people. And then 10 years later, then we had the housing bubble collapse, and that was a lot bigger. But this one, after 10 years of convincing the people that they can inflate forever and interest rates will be zero and you can spend forever, and we have to compete with the socialists like modern monetary theory, we have to continue to do it. Probably the amazing thing, but it's not totally unusual in history, that the masses of people will buy into it, and many people in Wall Street, I really believe they don't advocate the policy, but they need to be there to make the final dollar. But what I'm going to predict, Chris, is they won't be as smart as Buffett. Buffett has $128 billion on the sideline, because I think he suspects what's coming. But when the rush to the exits occurs, things will move very, very rapidly. And we'll talk a little bit about it today. Where are the cracks? What's going on? What is the evidence for our concern? Maybe we're overreacting, and maybe this is a new monetary theory. Maybe gold is not money. Maybe fiat money is the way to go. But I think I will continue the process of warning people that this is not a steady a system that we have, and it's not a wise system, and a lot of people are going to suffer from it, and we will have that big collapse, and it is getting closer all the time. I will not be surprised if the big one doesn't occur before the end of 2020. Chris?
That's right, Dr. Paul. We are in the biggest bubble ever, and biggest, big bubbles, they have big collapses. And Americans, unfortunately, most Americans are not in a good position for that to happen. Savings are very low to non-existent, and debts are sky high. And we just saw, you and I, a statistic today or yesterday showing that about almost half, about 40% of Americans have only about $1,000 in savings. And dependency is very big in America, where about half of the country is somehow getting some kind of federal money. And, this is not a good position to be in, because also many of the jobs that exist that people have are a result of the credit bubble. So when the bubble pops, they're going to have to be laid off. There's going to be no choice. And at the same time, as you pointed out, the Federal Reserve is pumping $100 billion a month, which is going to cause prices to rise. So if you're losing your job, prices are rising, and you're in such a bad financial shape, it's not good. It makes you very vulnerable, and you're desperate. And unfortunately, there are vultures out there that are swirling around that love desperation, because that's when they capitalize. They're like opportunists. And in America, you could see them swirling around. They're socialists. Of all people in America are trying to convince people that that's the way to go. But, I do have optimism. There is an American spirit in this country. It's just going to have to wake up fast so we can weather the storm.
Right, and there's a sequence that monetary systems go through, and we had the same sort of thing happen. We had a Federal Reserve created in 1913, but they didn't accomplish all their mischief and injury overnight. But they started pretty early on by printing the money for World War I and getting us involved where we shouldn't be, introducing the welfare state and all these things, and it persisted. Created the Great Depression. So they have done a lot of mischief, but it wasn't until 1971 when the pseudo-gold standard, the gold reserve standard, and Americans weren't even allowed to own gold, finally ended. And the significance of this is that the unit of account, which was the dollar, was destroyed. It became no meaning anymore, because it was always pretend, at least, that it was related to gold. Foreigners up until 1971 could put down $35 an ounce, and $35 of money we printed and passed out around the world and propped up our economy. They finally said, hey, we're tired of all these dollars. You would have thought that this would have brought it down, but it really didn't. There was a lot of rough time and a lot of adjustment through the 70s, but no, lo and behold, enough people were convinced that America could print money forever and ever, and we have been doing this. But the management of this becomes more difficult. So once you destroy the unit of account and endorse the fiat system, then the goal, of course, from them, and they, I imagine that many are serious and sincere because they're taught that in college, that you can have a better economy if you manipulate the money supply and manipulate interest rates, and they can do the central economic planning and send the money where it's important and necessary, along with the Keynesians in the Congress, to spend the money wisely. Well, they've been able to do that to a large degree, and right now, though, it runs out of steam. They can't. They lost control, and that's why I think September 17th of this past year is a significant day, and that's when the overnight rates went up to 10%. And I think that's when they knew the towel was being thrown in, because they're running out of tools. Most people now are just hanging by the thread about what's going to happen between now and the election, because Trump knew what short-term benefits would come from massive monetary expansion, as well as deficit financing. So he's been an expert. He got them to lower the interest rates and spend more money, run up deficit to $1 trillion a year. So it's been pretty amazing. But the one culprit result of all this, Chris, and you've already mentioned it from the individual, and that is debt. Debt will be paid for, and the corporate debt and personal debt and government debt is just totally out of control, and it's worldwide. This is not just the United States bubble that we're dealing with. And the one thing I think people can be convinced of, and they should expect, is when it reaches this point, the debt will be liquidated. And, does that mean, yes, that we're going to default and our government is going to default and not send out the checks and quit spending? No, there's too much political pressure for that. Who's going to volunteer? Okay, you can cut my benefits in half. Yeah, cut Social Security. None of that's going to happen. Military-industrial complex. We don't need $1 trillion a year to fight non-wars around the world. No, it's not going to happen. They're going to keep spending. But then how do you liquidate debt? You liquidate debt by the destruction of the monetary unit and the value of the currency. So if you can diminish the value of the currency overnight by 50%, you've gotten rid of half of your debt in real terms. And they generally have done this over the years. They liquidate debt and they like inflation. And right now, the price inflation rate is lower than the Fed wants. They know they want to liquidate debt faster. But the other thing that's going on, which is persistent, and we've mentioned this many times, is the fact that when you're trying to figure out what's happening, you should have some statistics from it and some evidence from it. And that's where growth numbers and unemployment numbers and all are fudge. That's not to say that some of the numbers we've heard in the last year or so aren't true, but they're superficial, but there's a lot that's hidden. The real effects of inflating the currency and how many problems there are. They're not going to mention these things. So if somebody on Wall Street and on evening business news talked about these issues, they would be pretty concerned, and they wouldn't like the psychological impact. But they should pay attention to people like Buffett and others, typical Wall Streeters. They say, this one's getting out of hand. We used to be able to anticipate when it started to get out of hands, the Fed would come in, but they did this time, and it didn't work, and that's why they gave up in September. So right now, Chris, I think what we're looking at and anticipating is when will it come and what will it look like, and nobody knows exactly. All we can do is anticipate it and maybe stab at it on the date that this is going to arrive.
Yes, Dr. Paul, and when it arrives, I fear that Americans, because we've been brainwashed that anytime there's any problem, the government has to do something. So that will probably be the call once the crisis arrives. Government has to do something. Even though government and the Federal Reserve created the problems, the call will be for them to do something. And obviously they can't fix it unless they stop what they've already been doing. They get out of the way. They stop intervening. They stop printing money. But that's not what people, when they're in desperate times, want. They want more rules, more rules, more rules. Take money from him, give it to me. And all it does is it makes the problem worse. That's why depressions usually become Great Depressions and last so long, because the government just keeps piling on, keeps doing the wrong thing with public support. They wanted to do it. Nobody wants to do the right thing. So I fear that may be the case because Americans are just so conditioned for government to solve problems that we may be in for a long haul.
Right, and a follow-up on the possibility of what will the event be. It could be an economic event like in 2008, a major bankruptcy, and this could, elicit the concerns and cause a cascading of it and other bankruptcies coming. And the debt that you mentioned about individuals, if there is just a slowdown and people stop spending or lose some jobs, that cascades and it gets very large, and there's no control because it's the collapsing of a pyramid. Since we talk a lot on this channel about foreign policy, I think the odds are growing that there's going to be an international event that will precipitate the crisis, because I think we're losing our stature. I think we're losing credibility around the world. We're spending more and more money, and we follow a policy which is not exactly friendly to other people. We wheel and deal and use sanctions, generously. We put on tariffs, and we also get involved in currency manipulations, and we tell other people what to do all the time, and we have a policy that the American people generally endorse. I mean, you'd think that one party used to be, there was a time in the 60s where we thought Democrats were a little bit better, on this, less warmongering. But just think of the chanting from the Democrats now to start a war with Russia. Every day, I think it was listed in one of the days with the impeachment hearings. I think negative views by one speaker was like nearly 100 times about Russia, 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 Russia. Well, Russia is hardly a perfect country, but sometimes when I think of how they're handling things less aggressively than ours, that, the confrontation, this whole idea that the Russians moved a few people toward the oil in Syria, and we were there, and they're not coming here. That's our oil. That's to pay for our bills. And that stuff. Yeah, it was a little confrontation, people expressing themselves, and yet it's been very emphatic that, in spite of all this, we own the oil. And if you look at Iraq and that whole region, they're starting to vote and be vocal about it. We're tired of you. Leave, get out. And something's going to break loose there, and it could happen tomorrow, the next day, or in a year. But that could be the precipitating event, at least that we're vulnerable there. But of course, the interest rates, the real interest rates, the markets are always more powerful. And that's why, even though they've contained, the overnight rates down to 1-2%, and they'll try to go to zero, that markets usually overwhelm. And that's what I think about and remember well about 1971, because for all those years since World War II, we erroneously kept the gold price at $35 an ounce, and it was artificial. And so that meant finally they had to give up on it, and they totally closed the gold window and said, we're not going to even associate with this gold definition of money. And so the market won over. Gold was not $35 an ounce, and now it's $1,500 a month, and it's going to go a lot higher because this isn't going to be corrected, and they're not going to be willing to bite the bullet, because biting the bullet is politically unacceptable. And that is cut spending. It's not going to happen. The welfare state and the warfare state is entrenched, and it's only going to go away when we go broke. And in technical language, we are broke. It's when the people of the world recognize that and admit that America is broke and that we're not going to take their funny money anymore.
Right, Dr. Paul, I'll finish up by saying, we talk about how most Americans are not prepared. And it's a shame, and I wish it was different, but we have to deal with the world as it is. The silver lining is, as individuals, you don't have to live like most Americans. You can live great during booms, busts, everything in between, by doing the right things and by specifically doing the exact opposite of what most people do. So if most people are spending beyond their means, you're saving. If most are racking up debt, you're paying your debts down. If they're looking for dependence, you're looking for independence. And, because dependency on government is a losing bet. Out of everyone, they're in the worst financial shape out of everyone. So let's, as many of us as possible, as individuals, do our best to swim against the tide.
Right, and I place most of the blame on governments, because they're the ones who offer freebies and respond to the special interests and spend the money and run up the debts and create the Fed and do all these things that ultimately ends up in disaster. It's also the government that orchestrates, the warring that goes on. And the government should be involved to a small degree. I mean, I don't think hardly any government is necessary. But if you're going to, you could think about what the founders had in their mind when they wrote the Constitution, which was imperfect. But at least when they talked about money, they talked about the unit of account. They talked about the dollar being sound. It had to be gold or silver in money. And that it was a very serious situation. And so if the government is involved, it should be to define and secure the official money as a weight of something that the people accept in the marketplace. But that is long gone, and now it's a fiat system, and it is uncontrollable, and the special interests are in charge. Governments aren't even identifiable anymore, because we wouldn't have this crazy stuff going on in Washington right now if you actually had a government run by a political party. But the deep state is involved, and the deep state has a lot of control over the monetary system, foreign policy, and the financial system. So no matter how hard somebody might work when they're there, it's not going to work out. And then there's this contest between the two parties on who has the power and the control. But government is too big, and real government is secret. That's the deep state. That's the part of the government that we can't define. But that is the most powerful force that controls what happens to us today. That is the reason that we have to emphasize the principles of liberty, that what we need to do is show that if there's a limited role for government, it's to guarantee liberty, and that is hands off. Let people have their privacy. Let them have their own personal choices, and have every activity be voluntary if there's no harm or injury to somebody else. This would create the prosperity, and it would protect the liberties that we should cherish. And I think the founders had that in mind, but we've drifted a long way from that. But we're going to have an opportunity, because this system we have today is coming down. It's not going to last like this. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year. Who knows? But there's something major is going to happen, and the adjustment is going to be rough, because too often it goes in the wrong direction. They say, oh, we don't have enough government power. And that's what we're hearing from the people who call themselves socialists and call themselves proponents of the modern monetary theory and all this nonsense, and the people who chant, Russia, 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 let's go after Russia. I mean, if they get in charge, then we're in big trouble. But we need more people knowledgeable and understanding about what liberty is all about, and limit government to the protection of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.